A big welcome to Michael Parenti, who's just joined us in studio. In fact, he's joined us on the West Coast. The guy has actually moved out here. You feel like a Berkeley resident yet, or?
Yes.
Funny, you don't look like a Berkeley resident.
Okay.
What does a Berkeley resident look
How
like?
do I know?
Michael Parenti, author of The Sword and the Dollar, Democracy for the Few,
Make-Believe Media.
And here on the West Coast, he is doing almost the same things you were doing on the East Coast, which was doing a great job of telling the world that what we see in our newspapers and on TV and here on the establishment media is make-believe frequently, or it's really not the reality. When we asked you what you wanted to talk about this morning, you said capitalism, and of course we all know that capitalism is responsible for saving the entire planet from any number of dastardly possibilities. Do you want to pontificate on just what capitalism has meant to you?
Well, I don't want to pontificate, but I would like to just remind people that capitalism is more than an economic system. It's an entire social order. And when we talk about capitalism, we're not talking about an economy only as such, but a system of class power. And that class power reaches into all the other major institutions of society. So that if you look, most of the other major institutions, the churches, the media, the museums, the sports teams, the hospitals, health industry, they're all run by boards of trustees. The universities, who are manned, sometimes womaned, but almost always manned by members of the corporate elites and the very rich who lay down the major policies for these institutions, all the policies if they want to. And there is an enormous oligarchic power. A plutocracy is the term I use in my book, Democracy for the Few. Plutocracy means rule by the rich and for the rich. It doesn't mean that every one of the decision makers is a rich person, though eventually they usually are, but that all of them will end up serving the corporate owning class. Henry Kissinger originally wasn't rich. He's a multimillionaire now. But he was plucked out of his academic career, his modest academic career, because he was writing the kinds of things that David Rockefeller and Nelson Rockefeller liked, and he was brought up and became a big policymaker advisor and eventually in the Nixon administration. And that kind of thing is the way it operates. This owning class that owns the land, the labor, the resources, the capital, controls the markets of our country. They don't own the labor; they employ the labor power. They also are largely self-recruiting when it comes to the top decision-making positions. So that the presidents, vice presidents, secretaries of state, defense, treasury, and commerce, the CIA head, the Federal Reserve head, and a few others like this are almost all members of the Council on Foreign Relations or the Trilateral Commission. Like Mr. Clinton himself or the Bilderberg Conference and all. These are organizations that were formed by plutocrats like Nelson Ulrich and John D. Rockefeller Sr. back in the 20s and 30s, and J.P. Morgan. So there is a remarkable cohesion of interest of these people, and they generally rule. Their job is to keep the government and the state especially actively engaged in maintaining existing social relations and class power relations.
Yeah, but the major myth, there's an underlying theme, which is if you're so smart, why ain't you rich? It's good to be rich. But the major myth is that anybody could be rich. That's the nature of capitalism, that all you have to do is be hardworking and you too can be smart.
There are occasionally people who do get rich that way, either
the
because
80s
they can
created how many new millionaires?
Well, the 80s, with the help from Reagan and the help from a tax policy and a subsidy policy and a government welfare for the corporations policy, that helped a lot. There was an awful lot of that brought brought much of that around. And there are individuals someone can wiggle their anorexic little frame across a stage like a Michael Jackson, you can become a multimillionaire. If you can hit a spherical horsehide object 350 feet with any regularity, you can get a $5 million contract as a baseball star. And then you can use some of that money on other things. And if you invent something, and there are some entrepreneurs who still to this day can sometimes get in on something and make $1 million or 10 million or whatever. They are the notable exceptions. And in any case, I'm not measuring the system by how many of us can get rich. I don't want to get rich. I just want to see the people of the United States living a decent life, drinking clean water, breathing clean air, having jobs, living with some measure of security, not in the kind of misery that exists now. They say that 34 million people are below the poverty level. Those are very cooked figures because the original poverty line was calculated almost, about 30 years ago, where it was a family of 4 had to have about $7,000 or something. And what they've done is they've changed that figure every year according to the cost of living allowance. But the cost of living index does not take in the fact that the 4 major essentials have gone up vastly higher than the rest of our goods and services.
Like
I'm talking
food
about
and shelter?
Food, fuel, housing, and health have gone up something like 100% more than the other items. There's no longer a pollution. We don't talk about a pollution problem as such. We talk about an ecology crisis. It's not just a matter of cleaning up this or that bay. It's a matter of determining whether or not the planet will survive or not survive with ozone depletion and global warming.
Let me ask you something. There was a remarkably revealing article on the front page of the business section of the San Francisco Chronicle, of all places, last week, in which they interviewed 3 former CEOs of major corporations and asked them very specifically who they primarily worked for and how they could represent the interests of their employees. And in all 3 cases, they said, well, of course, we work for the stockholders. Our job is to guarantee the stockholders a maximum return on their investment dollar. So when it comes to talking about the benefits, the wages, hours, benefits of our employees, we have to make the case to the stockholders that by paying our employees a little more money, that in the long run, the stockholders will benefit because these employees will be harder working, more diligent, more, all those good things. And then the same week, last week, Bank of America announces that they are going to reduce the hours of all the tellers at Bank of America, which absorbs Security Pacific, from full-time people to 19 hours a week so that they no longer would have to pay them benefits. Right. And I'm thinking, this is an interesting picture.
And by the way, Bank of America also reported record profits.
$1.5 billion.
Right, $1.5 billion in profits. So it wasn't an austerity necessity. It was rapacity. It was just to make more and more. Well, my reading of history, could I just jump back to the Roman Empire for a minute, Phil?
It's not much of a leap, no.
Okay.
It's your people.
Okay, I thought I should ask your permission before doing it. I was reading how in about the 1st century B.C., the Roman aristocracy went after I think it was called the agraria plebum, which was the land wasn't really owned by the plebes, but used by the plebes, what we would in this era call the commons, or the common lands in England, where people raised food and farmed and used the resources of these lands, game, whatever else, just as the British financial industrial class wiped out the British yeomanry and peasantry and drove them off the commons. The more resources that people have and they can just use directly for their own sustenance and themselves, the less is your wealth and power, because you need those people. You need their dependency and poverty to get them to work hard for very little so you can accumulate wealth off their labor. If they're working for themselves, if they're doing okay, then that becomes a potential threat. Furthermore, those were good lands. And I was sitting there and I was reading and I was saying, what do the what do the ruling classes, what do the owning classes, what do the rich throughout history, what do they want? And it came to me like a bolt, like a revelation, in one word. They only want one thing, and that's everything. They want everything. If there's any area where they can squeeze it a little more, and there's nothing, no countervailing power to stop them to squeeze it, then they'll squeeze it. Bank of America employees are not unionized. They don't have collective bargaining rights. They don't have, so you can just treat them like this. You can just cut them off and tell them to kiss off, and that's too bad.
You're listening to Michael Parenti joining us in studio, as indeed he's joined us on the West Coast, the author of Many's The Volume, Democracy for the Few, The Sword and the Dollar, Make-Believe Media, the titles that I recall without looking at your list.
That Inventing Reality is out in a new edition. Inventing Reality, The Politics of News Media. And I've also just finished a book last week called, well, it won't be out for a while, but it's called Land of Idols, Political Mythology in America. If you don't mind, I get up this hour just to be able to make a plug here or there.
Well, hey, it's whatever works. Once again, Michael Parenti, our guest, speaking of inventing reality and how this all fits into capitalism as we've come to know it, if not love it. The folks we just spoke to last hour with Fairness and Accuracy Reporting were talking about the spectrum of debate and how there isn't one, and that 45% really of the spectrum of political debate in this country is absent from our major media sources. What role does the media play in your version of capitalism here you've been describing?
Well, I think it was pointed out very well by Norman Solomon and Jeff Cohn, your previous guests, that the media are not really free and independent. They're owned by the same people who are the top decision makers, or who select the top decision makers, and who own the rest of the economy. And so their perspective is one which will amputate political discourse and the political spectrum, so that the whole left and progressive viewpoint is not given any kind of exposure. I don't want to reiterate what they just said so well.
Well, there is this notion, of course, capitalism is based on this notion of the marketplace. And in the marketplace, allegedly, the true value of a commodity or a person's labor is determined by competition.
Or an idea.
Right. So then we have the marketplace of ideas. The marketplace of ideas, modeled on the same notion of capitalism, would presume that the better idea, whatever better means, will win out because it's had to compete with those inferior ideas.
Mm-hmm. That would be okay with me if the ideas that have been muted and shunted to the side were allowed to honestly compete. But those ideas...
You have to have a lobbyist for ideas frequently.
Right. And those ideas don't get on. I think, as Marx said, that in every epoch the ruling ideas are the ideas of the ruling class, that those who control the material means of production also control the ideational and intellectual means of production, so that our ideas can get on small and valiant radio stations from time to time, and in small circulation magazines, but the mass market, the mass TV, the markets that reach not 20,000 people but 20 million people, we can't get on, or if we do, it's very limited, very irregular, and we're facing 3 conservatives who are screaming at us, and we can hardly get a word in. So our ideas are really not given fair play. If we could reach millions of people, I noticed, for instance, with my tapes, which are circulated by People's Video in Seattle, and people, I still get calls and letters from people saying, "This is amazing. Gee, this makes sense. I never heard anything like this before." Now, that's a very revealing comment. I never heard anything like this before, because what I tell them is not some occult, esoteric knowledge that I gleaned from the Himalayan mountains. I talk about things that are in the news and all that, but putting them together and giving a level of information that you're just not going to usually get.
Well, it's making connections that are not made. There's this whole
Which may I just say, which points out the point I'm making, that capitalism is more than an economic order. It's a whole social and cultural order, and it's a very controlled order, and it's a very, in a sense, totalitarian order, in that it doesn't have to have absolute control over the entire communication universe. All it needs is overwhelming, crushing advantage. It doesn't have to control 100%, but 98% will do quite well. And that 2% serves as a legitimating thing. You can say, see, well, you got your radio show.
KPFA is the 2%, right?
Right, well, right, you're part of the 2%.
Well, this is part of the whole mythology to me, is this notion of freedom. We think that we live in the land of the free. We have a free trade. We have free markets. We have free ideas. We're free here.
Well, free markets and free trade is freedom for people who have lots of money and a lot of economic power. That's for whom there is freedom.
Well, but that's how the 98% is controlled, because they've got this concept that, hey, if they wanted to, they could do this. It's just their own. They blame themselves if they're not rich.
There certainly is that popular mythology that the millionaire is self-made. But people are a little more complex than that. The same people who will sometimes adhere to Horatio Alger also know in their gut that there are people born. I mean, even my late dad, who was a kind of an Archie Bunker kind of guy, but he used to talk about those who were born with a silver spoon in their mouth. So they do know that there is favoritism. He used to talk about how the working man always gets it in the neck, and we're the last on line, and all that sort of thing. So.
Now we've got a
they
president
do have that, and the
work
question is, how do you galvanize and bring that consciousness to the fore, so it's not just a implicit gripe, but it's mobilized for political action that could bring us a greater share of social justice. I'm sorry, Chris, you say we have a president.
Yeah, I was just thinking that Bill Clinton is an example of somebody who rose from poverty to the greatest office in the land.
Tell us what your impression is thus far of what he's doing. Is he strictly the servant of the wealthy classes, or is there any mixed message here?
Well, I mean, I think it is. It's a bit better than what we would have had George Bush. I remember coming into this very station and saying that I was going to hold my nose and vote for Clinton. When I said hold my nose, I wasn't being cute. I mean, the guy stinks in some ways. I mean, his appointees some of them are just terrible. The national security state retreads who definitely reflect no new way of thinking about the world, about the third world, about U.S. interventionism, about a lot of those kinds of things. There's that problem. You got Secretary of Interior, Bruce Babbitt, who should be in jail. I mean, this is the guy who did the cover-up on the murder of the radio journalist Dan Bowl. When they got the guy who did the shooting, they let him cop a plea, and they railroaded two innocent people. His book just out, reviewed in The Nation, on this, and it was Babbitt who played a key role in all of this, covering up what Dan Bowl was doing. Dan Bowl was in Arizona. You remember that? He was uncovering some very powerful interests in Arizona, and this guy is now Secretary of Interior. In fact, he should be investigated. So you've got that kind of thing going on, and you've got a few little sops to the populist movement, in the sense he's going to increase. He's going to give a minor increase in corporate taxes, but meanwhile, $15 billion in investment credits to the same business elites.
Explain what an investment credit is.
Well, that if they invest in certain things and retooling and all that, they will get tax credits for it. They will get not a tax deduction, but something better than that. I mean,
this is cash.
Yeah, they will get. It means you won't get. It doesn't mean $1 million of your income will not now be taxed. It means $1 million of the taxes you had to pay will be given back to you.
So that's $1 million. I mean, you get straight money.
Yeah, it's going to be money. But often what happens is these companies take it on retooling that they were going to do anyway. They don't just suddenly then do all sorts of new things and increase their production and hire 500 new workers if there's no market out there to buy these new refrigerators and all that. So it really becomes a tax windfall. And these tax credits and these investment credits and all inducements and so forth, every administration has been handing those things out, and it hasn't led to Can I point out that's another myth about capitalism, that it's the self-willed entrepreneur, of whom there are some, and who are inventive, and who do, by the way, create jobs and all that, and they're usually very small capital. But if you look at the corporate 500 and the big corporations, they've created very few jobs. In fact, they're getting very good at cutting back thousands, tens of thousands of jobs right before our eyes. But much of their funding in many industries and whole industries have not come from their own resourcefulness and pockets. It has come from the U.S. government. Whole industries, the telecommunications industry, was built by socialism. That is, by public subsidy, from the purse of the taxpayers of America. The aeronautics industry. I mean, all through World War II, after the war, the whole military buildup from 1948 on, the aeronautics industry, and that included Lawrence Rockefeller and the DuPonts and the Morgan and the J.P. Morgan groups and so forth, invested in all these areas. General Electric, the biggest single aeronautics, the biggest single military contractor in America for decades. They put up about 10% of the equity. The other 90% came from the Pentagon. So you see, and they would always calculate profits on general costs and say, well, it cost this much to make this bomber, and we made just 10% profit. But if you put aside general costs, if you don't tell anybody that 90% of those general costs were picked up by the taxpayer, and you put only 10%, then you didn't make 10% profit. You made closer to 100%. You doubled your investment, or you made 50% or 60%, and that's still going on today. So these very same people who preach to us on Sunday, every Sunday, that we should practice self-reliance, we should not go to the government for a handout and all that, they themselves, through the rest of the week, are living high off the public hog.
I'm thinking of two corporations close to home, Bechtel and Kaiser, both of whom obviously made their money off of government contracts from the get.
H. Ross Perot, could we mention him? He also made his billion off government contracts.
Medicare.
Right, Medicare. He took a whole Medicare system, computer system that had been worked out by the government, by the U.S. taxpayer, and it was privatized, handed over to him, and it was just a license to print money practically, and he made his millions marketing that, and then spends the rest of his time talking about the rugged individual private entrepreneur and the blessings of capitalism.
There, in a previous interview we did about a week ago, we talked to a man who wrote the book The Lobbyists. And he said there are 80,000 lobbyists in Washington, D.C., both in the Hill and going after the executive branch. And I was thinking that if, in fact, in the marketplace of ideas, the better idea wins out because it's obviously the better idea, then, of course, you wouldn't need lobbyists, because lobbyists are, in essence, influence peddlers, people that try to push a bad idea down people's throats because somebody's going to make money off of it. So, in essence, what kind of system do we have? Is it just a bribe-taking, bribe-giving kind of system? Is that what we're talking about here?
Well, I think there are two things there. What you're talking about are issue politics here, where specific issues are pursued by specific lobbyists for specific advantages. Sometimes it's the haves versus the haves, the trucking industry versus the airliners or something like that. But generally, the one group left out of all that is the broad, unorganized public that our interests generally aren't represented. That's part of the system. The other part of it is the system as a totality, which you might not call interest politics, but class politics, that over and above any one interest group, you need a state, which is a conscious agent for control and for doing the things that no one interest in the society can do for itself. That is, I mean, the state also has other functions, which are public safety, the ordinary accommodations for any civilized society. But besides that, its other function is to make sure that the existing property relations and the existing system of corporate capitalism will exist. This includes sometimes ignoring the interests of specific capitalists because they're pursuing the interest of the total society. For instance, those companies that want to trade with Cuba are regularly ignored, and people say, well, you see, the corporations don't run everything. There are corporations that want to trade with Cuba, but the U.S. government won't let them. Because the U.S. government, at least that portion of the government known as the state, the national security state, its function is not for a particular corporation to make a killing in a particular market. Its function is to make sure that those systems of markets are maintained as they are. And that entails rolling back and getting rid of any kind of country or system that has an alternative way of using land and labor and investment. And so they had their eye on the larger systemic function of the system. So we should make a distinction between systemic politics or class politics, if you want, on one hand, and specific issue politics on the other. Of course, in the specific issue politics, there's always a class interest dimension in them. I'm not denying that. There's overlap.
I'm hearing echoes of a conversation we had earlier this week with Noam Chomsky, who was pointing out the possibilities for any real health care reform, and mentioning that the one way to make sure that single-payer Canadian-style health care did not become the model for us would be to destroy the Canadian model by forcing them to raise the prices of their pharmaceuticals, because it's unfair to have such low-priced pharmaceuticals just across the border from our high-priced pharmaceuticals.
Well, that might be one thing that's going to happen. What we have to do is mobilize a contrary opinion and point out how the pharmaceutical industry prices are they're going up 20-30% faster than inflation itself, which means that they're price gouging. And I think there are people in Congress who are attuned to that, and I've even seen one or two stories in the mainstream media. There are a lot of corporations that want to see some kind of a change, because the health industry, the price gouging and the profiteering in the health industry is really incredible. And it's become one of the single biggest costs for corporations, for the benefits for their workers, which is why you're getting something like the Bank of America knocking off these people to get them below 50% work week, so they don't have to pay their health benefits anymore. So that what you have is the capitalist portion of the health industry as a portion of the capitalist class cutting into the profits of the rest of the capitalist class. So you're actually getting corporations now saying, we need a different system. They're saying it because they don't want to pay this anymore. And there's two ways they can do that. One, you can get a really good public support system, or two, you can just cut these benefits for your own employees and the hell with everything and let them sink or swim.
I'm going back to that Chronicle article where who does a CEO of a corporation in fact work for? And obviously it's the stockholders.
Right.
Given that the CEO's job is to maximize the profit for the stockholders, then what happens to the workers in that particular corporation is totally secondary to that. And so if in fact the tellers at Bank of America branches throughout the state are unorganized. They can't go on strike because they don't have any way of acting in solidarity with one another. Maybe the CEO, whose name I don't even know, of Bank of America is doing his job when he attacks them based on their benefits. I mean, that's what he's paid to do. That's what he's paid to do. That's his job.
Well, you're absolutely correct, because his job is not to make a profit for the stockholders, but it is, as you put it, to maximize the profit, to make the maximum amount of profit. And if I am making $1.5 billion and I could make $2.3 billion by cutting out all health benefits, cutting back on this, and when you cut those kind of hours, that means other people are going to have to work harder. You're doing what is right. David Roderick made that point as head of U.S. Steel, now USX. He said the function of U.S. I guess then it was USX. He called, when U.S. Steel became USX. When I was a kid in school and I studied algebra, X was an unknown quantity. What do we make? We make X. We make what is X? Money. We just make money.
Yeah.
And Roderick made that point. He said, U.S. Steel is not in the business of making steel. When it was still U.S. Steel, that's right. He said, it's not in the business of making steel. It's in the business of making, and he didn't say profits. He said the highest possible profits for its stockholders. So they'll sell. They'll do this, they'll do that, they'll do whatever it takes. So not only does the workers' interests are secondary, but the workers' interests are in fact in opposition to those of what I have to do. There are interests that have to be counted and minimized in every way and attacked.
Neutralized, that's right.
Well, that's
I was going to
not
say the
very
workers'
fair.
interests were irrelevant, but they're totally relevant because the workers'
Right.
interests are diametrically opposed
Right. inimical, right?
Right. We're talking with Michael Parenti, and we're just about out of time. And Chris has another question. I can tell by the look on her face.
Well, I don't understand how. I feel like Rodney King. Why can't we just get along? I mean, the workers' interests, I would think, would be vital to the continuing and long-lasting health of the business.
No, I think Phil just made the point. No, the more I have to pay my workers, the more you're cutting into my profits, because my workers are my source of profit.
They're not also your consumers?
The worker contributes. Yeah, but that's way down the road. There'll always be someone else to buy. You're right. I mean, you lay off these number of workers, they're going to have less bank accounts for Bank of America, and they're going to have less money to put into Bank of America. So eventually that might happen. But capitalism operates proportionally, always in terms of rates and ratios. And if I can increase my rate of profit, even if I'm way down the line cutting out some portion of my base, then that's fine with me.
There's also the business of short-term profit versus the long run. Right. And with all these leveraged buyouts, the long run isn't even considered. I mean, if you're Maxam Corporation that bought Pacific Lumber up on the North Coast, your bills are coming due. You're paying huge interest bills on all that money you borrowed, and you better chop down every damn tree now or yesterday because you got to maximize the profit.
Right.
Does anybody think about the long run that, 10 years down the road there's not going to be a tree to cut down anymore, or is that somebody else's problem?
Well, that's the other myth of capitalism, that how efficient they are, that in fact they dump their diseconomies onto the public. We are the ones who have to think about the unemployed. We are the ones who have to think about the red line districts where people can't even get decent housing. We are the ones who have to think about the devastated economy, and we have the ones who have to think about the cleanup and the toxic waste that they leave behind them. They skim the cream, and then the government and the public has to do the rest, and then they turn around and say, you see how much more efficient we are than government is. But that's really, all of that is a part of capitalism. What Clinton's doing now, this mess that he's shoveling out to us now, is a representation of the last 12 years and the kinds of levels of exploitations that we have suffered as working people, as taxpayers, and as ordinary citizens, and as consumers. We get exploited and ripped off in all four of those areas.